So I'm going to talk today. My little didactic is about reward. It's about really the maladaptive regulation. Now, and again, part of what I'm trying to do is make these little presentations kind of obviously relevant for the current situation, but I do believe a lot of these uh, concepts will be helpful in some of your work after all of this is over. So I'm going to talk a little bit about reward, and I'm going to talk about efforts to externally regulate. And I think I have this in here somewhere. I know I do have it in here somewhere. So you've seen me present this, and let me actually make this, actually do that. So you've seen me talk about the routes that we have for self-regulation. And we have this top, this bottom-up version. We have the top-down, kind of the executive functioning, use your words version of regulation. You calm yourself down. You keep saying, as adults, well, this will end, and blah blah blah, and you all know how effective that top-down effort is. It works for about 30 seconds, and then you realize that you're still pretty dysregulated. And we've talked a little bit about dissociation, and we'll talk some more about that in the upcoming sessions again. But one of the things that is really important to remember is that there are other ways to get regulated besides these routes that we've talked about for self-regulation. There are ways to get external regulation. And my favorite form, and I think the most powerful form of external regulation, is when you have another person who you can regulate with. And we've talked a little bit about emotional contagion and co-regulation and co-dysregulation. But many of you may have noticed down here, and I don't end up talking about it too much, but you can artificially, externally manipulate these internal systems by using substances. And a lot of people use pharmacological regulation. They find that when they have a cigarette, that's regulating. They find that when they have a drink, it makes them feel calmer. Some people discover that, wow, those opiates I took for my pain control after I broke my leg, I felt pretty regulated. And I don't know how many of you remember the song. I played the John Prine song last session, or a couple sessions ago, about one of his songs about a guy who comes back from Vietnam and he got injured, and he found that the opiate took away regulated him, took away the pain from the shrapnel in his knee, but it also took away the emotional pain of being what he saw in Vietnam. And this is something that I think we all know is a big part of the whole child abuse, maltreatment, domestic violence, mental health world, is that a lot of people, as part of that mix, use pharmacological routes to regulate. And I want to talk a little bit about that I always think if you understand the underlying biology of things, or the at least part of the underlying mechanism, that it helps you get a better appreciation of what it is that you're dealing with, and what you might be able to do to try to help it. So let's start with a little basic biology. I think a lot of you are very familiar with a chart kind of like this. And it may be because you've seen me present it, or you've seen other people present something similar to this. But we know that there are, in the human brain, certain networks that if they get activated, you will feel pleasure. And as we have talked about in the training, in the neurosequential model training, one of the things that we learn about is that the relationships that are formed early in life between relational attention and relationally mediated quenching of a physiological need. And that because you have this hungry, thirsty, cold, dysregulated child, and you have an attentive, attuned, responsive parent, when they come and meet your fundamental needs, the infant's brain begins to make an association between this person who is responding to you or attributes of that person, and the fact that you are essentially, and let me get the right image here, you're essentially, where is it? Oh, I've got the traumatic ones in here. I don't have this other one in here. All right, well, pretend, let me think about how to, so I don't have this slide up here. Well, let's pretend this, let's do this. Let's pretend you have this external caregiver coming and meeting your fundamental needs. And here is the person, and I'm going to draw this. And here is this caregiver, this happy caregiver is going to come and meet your fundamental needs. And what happens is into the lower parts of your brain will come all kinds of different sensory cues that will be associated with their presence, feeding you, warming you, quenching your thirst. And so all of your physiological regulatory needs get met, and you can calm down. And so at the same time that you're getting calmed down, here you get dysregulated, caregiver comes in, and you start to get quenched, and your brain makes an association right in here between the relational sensory cues, the reward, which is the relief of physiological distress, and regulation. And so there's this three-part association that's created, this very powerful triune complex association between relational attention and reward and regulation. And those three R's, relationship, reward, and regulation, those things get woven together. And as you get older, that plays, oh, here's where it is. Sorry. As you get older, you draw upon this set of associations to calm yourself down. And so when somebody comes and meets your fundamental needs, they see you're upset, you're hungry, you're thirsty, you're cold, you're frightened. Here comes this loving caregiver, and they meet your fundamental needs, and you calm down, and you feel pleasure, and you feel regulated. And so one of the things that we know is that relieving physiological distress in and of itself activates the reward systems. And because of that early process, positive human interactions also stimulate this part of the brain. So you can get pleasure and reward from human connection, pleasure and reward from sweet, salty, fatty foods, pleasure and reward from rhythmic things such as music or other pattern repetitive rhythmic things. You can indirectly or basically externally, but directly activate these networks and get pleasure by taking certain drugs. If you do something that's consistent with your values, it can be rewarding. And if you use alcohol, for example, particularly if you're very physiologically distressed, you have a sensitized stress response system, and you're at baseline high anxiety, and you drink some alcohol, you find that that makes you feel more regulated. So alcohol, for somebody who's very, very anxious, will use alcohol to self-medicate. And so we have all of these different routes towards getting reward. Now, the key is, and I could talk about a couple different aspects of this, but today what I want to talk about is this. I want to talk about everybody every day has to fill their reward bucket. And there's sort of a certain minimal level of that you have to get. And if you don't get there, you feel literally you are reward hungry, and you seek all kinds of other forms of reward. Many of them are not particularly healthy. So if you have your reward bucket gets filled a little bit by some relational interactions, and you have some opportunities for some music and some rhythm, and you have a couple of drinks, and or you smoke a little pot, and whatever it is that makes you feel rewarded, you have some sweet, salty, fatty foods, you're starting to get near your threshold, and then you sort of do something that's consistent with your beliefs. You go volunteer at the soup kitchen, and you help people, and you've met your threshold. And so you've got a combination of these things, and that even, this is like, it's not like you got tons of relational stuff, but you put together a relational and a rewarding day to kind of get through the day. And there's a lot of people that kind of do this. They have different combinations of things that they do that help fill them up. And if you have a lot of relational stuff, if you have a world that's like this, let's say your child who has all kinds of high relational contact, as opposed to somebody like this is the best day of a child in foster care. There were several days when this child actually not only had very, very few positive things, but this child had lots of negative things. And so instead of relational, interactions making him feel safe and regulated, relational things made him feel more dysregulated, because he was getting signals that you don't belong here. Why are you so stupid? How many times do I have to tell you? I'm sick of this. You don't quit acting like a baby, all that kind of stuff. That's not regulating, that's dysregulating. And so this kid's reward bucket is going to be filled with a lot of relational stuff, whereas this child's reward bucket is going to be relationally pretty empty. And so you go back to here, and this person has pretty good relational stuff. They do a little rhythm, they go running, they do their music, they do their dancing, they get a little sex, sweet, salty, fatty foods. They do something consistent with their beliefs. This person's got a full day, right? That's a good day. They've filled their reward bucket in a really healthy way. And then there's somebody, poverty of relationships, right? And the more impoverished you are relationally, because relational reward is so important, the more relationally impoverished you are, the more likely you are to experience poverty of reward. And poverty of reward drives you to a lot of other routes to seek reward. And many of those routes are maladaptive over time. You find yourself, if you've got poverty relationships, you might spend a little bit more time trying to fill the reward bucket with a couple more drinks and smoking pot a little bit more than you normally do it, and maybe experimenting with some other drug that you might not normally experiment with. And you might eat a lot more sweet, salty, fatty foods than you would typically eat. And the more you are relationally impoverished, the more likely you are to do these kinds of things. And that puts you at risk. And so one of the things that I'm worried about is that there's all kinds of people who are, they're between here and here, and some people are lucky enough to have lots of relational stuff, and some people kind of have, just kind of a basic relational contact with people at work or the kids that they teach. But they fill their reward bucket, they get to this threshold with a combination of pretty healthy things, even though they may do some things that are, everybody eats some sweet, salty, fatty foods. Maybe I drank a little bit, but it was never like more than a couple of beers a day. But all of a sudden, here we are in the midst of this thing where you're not able to kind of do things that are consistent with your values, because you can't go volunteer at the soup kitchen. You can't see as many people as you used to see, because you're not going to school to teach. You're not coaching. You're not doing whatever it is that you used to do to get out and get those little bits of relational reward. And so you're eating more, and you're not able to do sex because you can't. All you got is a little bit of online porn, and because you can't go hang out with anybody. So that even though that might be a little bit rewarding, it's not the same as the real thing. And And so you're basically making yourself more vulnerable to some of these, to substances. And this is part of what I'm a little worried about, is that I think there are people who are on the, and again, let me just sort of draw something here. You know, kind of the way people use substances kind of exists on a spectrum. You know, there's a lot of people that are over here that don't do anything. And then there's people down here that really struggle. And a lot of, you know, most people are kind of that do use alcohol or other substances are kind of in this moderate range. And what I'm worried about is that in the absence of both opportunities for healthy relational stuff and healthy acting on your own beliefs, because a lot of people are feeling right now, experiencing what we would call moral injury. They're feeling like they're on the sidelines and watching people that they work with typically struggle in a way that they can't do anything about it. And so that's distressing. And so the inability to kind of really fully act on your full set of values and beliefs, it means there's going to be more people over here that are in this highly vulnerable place. And what I'm worried about is that there's going to be this shift in this curve where there'll be more people that kind of get over here. And, you know, this is sort of an exaggeration, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's higher, you know, people drink more, people use more. That leads to more conflict in relationships. That leads to more conflict in homes. That leads to more kids witnessing conflict. That leads to more kids, you know, if they melt down and they're externalizing their symptoms in the midst of this, that leads to more frustrated parents with lower threshold for acting because they've been drinking, you know, doing things that may impact their child. And so that's kind of one of the things I'm a little worried about with this. And and again, I could go on and on forever, but